Our Heavenly Father, how majestic is your name in all of heaven and earth. You sit above the circle of the earth. You stretch out the heavens like a curtain. You set your glory above the heavens. Thank you, Father, for Marty and his work, and for this group discussion today. We thank you, too, for the work of Thomas Torrance's friend, Harold Nebelsick, with this book, The Circles of God, an effort to ultimately glorify your name through a symbiosis of theological and natural science working in harmony together. So we ask your blessing, Father, by the Holy Spirit, in the name of Jesus Christ, through whom you created all things, heaven and earth, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Bill.
You're welcome.
All right, well, today we continue our journey through the 12 volumes of T.F. Torrance's edited work, Theology and Science at the Frontiers of Knowledge. So T.F. wrote the first one, and the second one continues the conversation along and picks up on some of the early themes, in a sense, in T.F.'s own first work, but also throughout his work, he is going to discuss the nature of the relationship between theology and science. And he is one of those who isn't attempting to try and integrate or prove based on science, but rather is attempting to acknowledge the place of theology as providing even the mechanisms whereby the clarifying conversation that we call science has come into its being. Not that there aren't modes of thinking, as we will see in this book, that one could call theology before Christian theology came into play. So this is it's a book that has historical depth, but as I talked with Carrie Magruder yesterday, to say at some level it's a book in honing our theological attunement so that we can recognize that there is a place where we can speak overtly about theology when speaking of God, but when we begin with speaking about the nature of the created world, there has been a long history of people getting ideas of God, projecting it onto the universe, and coming up with conclusions that, in some ways, helped by virtue of recognizing an orderly world, but in many other ways, they led things astray. So the nature of this book in the series of trying to encounter the future of what knowledge might look like in this relationship is going to take us back and just recognize that if you don't see the history that's behind it, you're likely to fall into problematic ways of functioning that Torrance wants to make sure we don't pursue. And specifically, Nebelsick was attuned to this question of something that I didn't think about, just the nature of astronomy and just how important it might be in the history of science. But here it is. It's one of those major kinds of things. So just to note a little bit, if you have the handout that I printed out, after the outline is an obituary that Torrance wrote in 1953, which he died early. He wrote three books that are important for Torrance conversations and died early. In a number of places that I looked for reviews of this book, people began almost always talking about him dying early, so he didn't get a chance really to develop in his lifetime all that he might have. So when TF says, I first met Harold Nebelsick in October 53 when he came to Scotland, was enrolled as a PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh. So that would have been there with TF. He had already majored in philosophy at the University of Nebraska, graduated Bachelor of Theology at San Francisco Theological Seminary, cum laude. He had been drawn to New College, Edinburgh by the reputation of John Bailey. That was during the heyday of the high ecumenical dialogue that followed the World Conference of Faith and Order in Lund, 1952, in which John Bailey and I, that's TF, were heavily involved. Harold was set to work on the ecclesiology of Charles Gore, who I don't know, which is
Hmm.
completed. He completed in 1956, gaining his PhD. His years of research at New College were fruitfully interlaced with further studies on the continent at Göttingen, Berlin, Basel, presumably there with Barth, and Paris. Soon his main interest switched from philosophical theology to Christian dogmatics. And one might say this book, in some ways, really reflects somebody who goes from a kind of philosophical philosophy to really thinking theology out of the nature of the God revealed in the person of Christ. So the fact that Nesselbeck's interests switch from those is in some ways reflected in the very flow of what's in this book. So he devoured then the church dogmatics of Karl Barth, and at the same time began to develop his lifelong interest in the interrelations between theology and natural science, not least in their underlying epistemological structures. How do we know what we know through them? So again, this book was published in 1984, was
I,
it? Or 85. So the time between when he finished his doctorate in 56 to this point had been almost 20 years. So he had been fruitfully involved in continuing his education and his growth and all that. So to say there's a personal relationship, when Torrance started writing the series, the center there at Princeton was a place where people would come and study, and apparently Nebelsick spent time there at Princeton doing research on the subject that's at hand here. So at the time this was written, Nesselbeck was the professor of doctrinal theology at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. So he's following in the Presbyterian tradition. So again, I've got a little statement there. This book argues that natural science was a spin-off from theology. So that's not theology proper, Christian theology. It is to say that the nature of how humanity, as it began to do investigative work on the nature of the world, it had thoughts about why the world was the way that it is. And particularly to say that there are divine forces or even persons, the gods, small g, that were at play in the mind of those who begin to do the work of establishing what we have come to call science. So this book on theology and science, or this book within the series, explores the theological thought as a presupposition of scientific discovery and difficulty. So again, yesterday with Kerry, when I said, science says, and he says, we always need to recognize science is very diverse. There's a community of science, to which I said, when I say science, I'm thinking of Micah Polanides' community of explorers. And so to say from ancient times, from Babylonian times, really, there were those who were explorers of the nature of the universe. Why does it exist the way that it does? And over the centuries, through the period of the Greeks and on into the medieval synthesis with Thomas Aquinas and up to our own time through Copernicus and Galileo and all that, there have been those who wanted to understand the world, and they couldn't do it at some level without thinking about divine influences in it. And so to say that the title of the book, The Circles of God, is to say that the fascination with the patterns that one gets with the nature of the movements of the planets, particularly in what appear to be circular motions, and even the circles of planets and the moon and all those things. And again, Carey said, we tend to think that the ancient world thought, flat Earth. He said, at the time of Jesus, he said, he gave me this illustration. He says, I sometimes will take a basketball and say, if this is the size of the Earth and a golf ball, I think it was a golf ball, it was anyway, not very big, is the moon. There's a fair relationship there. How close do you think the Earth is to the moon if we were to put it in here? And he says, he does this and people, they don't quite know where to go, but he says it actually would be about 30 feet away. So you need a big enough room to walk 30 feet with the moon. And so he says, if you think of a spaceship getting on a little speck of sand and going all the way 30 feet over to that, it'd be quite a journey. He said, then I asked them, what would the normal person in the time of Jesus think the distance was from the earth to the moon? And of course, people throw out a number of numbers. And he says, they would think it would be 30 feet. He said the ability for those people that lived at the time of Jesus to actually know that the earth was round and the distance the moon was from the earth is the same level of knowledge that we have now. That
Wow.
they had a much more advanced kind of knowledge than we accredit them to. So part of the point of that is to say that the ancient world, it's easy to think of them as not having, you know, all the insights we do because of certain things like telescopes and so forth, but that there were people who had sophisticated ways of recognizing the nature of shadows and the shadow of an eclipse with the sun and the moon, and there's an ability to then begin figuring out distances. I can't give you all of the equations of how those work, but they had the ability to do all that, which is quite amazing. So to say the Babylonian period of time, which one of the points that I'll make, that Carrie makes, is that this book was written in 1985. Since then, there has been a Copernican revolution around Copernican studies. And one of the things that Nebelsick
Oh,
would not have been aware of was how much there was really on Babylonian influence for what then was contributed to the Greeks, who then went on to contribute it in all the other kind of ways where he really picks up the story. But he says there is an ongoing flurry of just recognition of how much the Babylonians knew even before the Greeks. So, you know, he starts the first chapter, Greek theology and Greek science, but there really could be a whole nother chapter before that with Babylonian insights into what would have gone on, and that the nature of Daniel, when he was in captivity there, that he would have actually been exposed to quite significant astronomers within Babylonian culture and would have known much of the kind of things that undergirded Greek culture later, because Daniel studied with, again, the best kind of scholars of the day. He also says, this was Carrie said, we don't recognize that the Star of Bethlehem and that there were these astronomers who came from the East. It's easy to just think of them as, you know, kind of magicians of the ancient world, but to say the odds are they were actually quite competent astronomers who actually were able to read the stars and recognize something going on that we may not have insight to. They may have more insight than we do because we've, in a sense, taken the stars for granted in ways that they were much more aware of things going on. Where to go with all that, I'm not sure, but it's just to say we can't transport our sense of ignorance on the ancient world in a way that we might like to, and really get an accurate picture of them. So to say there is an indebtedness in the ancient world, the insight that is there, that is one of the things that is being acknowledged, is that science has always looked at the world as it is. Sometimes they come up with reasons for why they think it is the way it is that can become problematic. And so the title Circles of God is to say that for many people, the nature of the circles of planets, for some of them, they were thought to be solid, and some of them they were thought to be liquid. And for some, there's a sense that the Earth was thought to be motionless, and others thought that it moved in a circle, it rotated. The nature of, does the sun rotate in a circle around the Earth? Did the planets, what are the circles that the planets are rotating in? These are all questions that for many people, the answer was, well, God or the gods have made it to be that way. And the other significant piece in that is that for a long time, there was a sense that what we would call the heavenly realms, as we look at them, were not of the same sense of reality as what we function in here on Earth. We're so used to thinking, well, we're on Earth and the moon's just more, you know, further out, and the stars are just a bit further out. So to really get the breakthroughs of thought that the nature of all of those things that are out there moving are not just kind of on a big screen or of an entirely different substance from what we're looking at, and to say that it's all part of one nature, that's T.F. Torrance's big affirmation of holistic thinking, seeing the whole together, and the nature of all of it needs to be seen working together, which T.F. Torrance is going to use for that world realistic thought. So if it's not realist, then somebody is taking an idea and projecting it onto it. And so if you project the idea of the gods who's moving those things, and in some cases the planets don't always move in nice, neat circles. So if you're working with a worldview that says, well, there's got to be a reason for that, they must have their own personality, or there must be a God who's moving them in a particular way in those times. And so there's a kind of theology that's now reading onto the nature of the physical world that at one level is problematic. At one level, people are observing way, way back what's happening, but the reason why it happens is not in place. And so to say we have an intersection in these early phases of human history, where people are asking questions and they're acknowledging at some level the nature of what one might think of as God and what one might think of as nature. But it takes a long time to figure out how we think appropriately of them all together. So in the nutshell that I have here then for this book, on my handout, the history of the relationship between theology and science begins in the skies. The orderliness of the heavens gave the impression that they were divine, a product of personal forces. So you can see that people might think of personal forces there, and so they arrive at a theology out of that. Astronomers came to measure and plot the movements of planets in the earth. So when we think about the nature of science as it develops it, the language of mathematics and physics and all that's going to be providing the language of what comes to be called science. But you can see here, you can attribute even those measurements and the orderliness of them being given to a divine source. So proper science requires a detachment to see each part, and that is to see the physical world at some level, not reading in these things, to see each part in a realistic manner and not read one into the others. So cross-disciplinary conversations, that is between the different readings of stars and the nature of the earth and the nature of theology, became a realistic reading with growing respect and possibilities over time. And so the revolutions at some level that come with Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler, they had the ability to see, yes, the world is there, but we can't understand the same kind of projection of the divine onto it. There needs to be what Torrance is going to call katafusin, an appropriate acknowledging the reality of each without collapsing them into one another. That is the divine and the created world. So, so this book is wanting us to recognize that when we're doing science, it's really easy for people to look at the created world and read their interpretations of God onto it. And this is classically what Karl Barth's going to call natural theology. The nature of those claims then are people taking ideas in their head and thinking God must be like that. And so its source is in the human and not actually in relationship to the God who is the creator. So as we look at the issues that are here, it's going to be a common theme throughout all 12 of the books, I believe, that there's just this clarity of thought that says science needs to be done well as science. The world as it's created needs to be heard on terms that are its own terms, what T.F. Torrance and Carrie Magruder call contingent thinking. If we don't see the contingency of the world and the necessity of seeing a story appropriate to the nature of what is there, then we will misread it. So one of the other things, just and the word context that I have underneath the nutshell, Carrie brought out just how important it is to recognize that Torrance and Nebelsick were really responding to an era of the positivists in science. And so he said, the best way to understand positivism is that we assume that we observe reality. And so the human becomes central. We, out of hand, reject all religious explanations for anything. So positivism it won't listen to anybody saying that God creates or anything like that. And we only accept knowledge as a generalization from observation. So it must be true for everyone, everywhere, and based on observation. What we learn in studying in grade school, the scientific method, we are observers, and our observation is what is going to give us the scientific method. No sense of God, all of that is excluded. No story, which I asked Harry, so you would say that with, he loves to use the illustration of geology. So I said, so a positivist wouldn't let you tell the story of the rocks that are there? And he says, that's right. In fact, they rejected the idea of tectonic plates until they could see it, because it was outside of their thinking. So the nature of even standing with something that, for the nature of the earth as we know it, with tectonic plates, they rejected it out of hand because it was not observable. It wasn't a revelation that they could experience and observe in such a way. So you can recognize the human then becoming this kind of observing authority. If I can't see it, then it doesn't exist, is almost the way that's there. And so Torrance with Polanyi and Einstein are rejecting, even in this book, it's a recognition of a point in time where theology and science are rejecting a positivist reading and what we call Einstein's theory of relativity, the nature of Torrance, what he would call realism, which Carrie, when I said, so if you said not positivist, what would you use? And he says, well, with scientists, if I have time with them, I'll just say science katafusen, according to the nature of that which I'm studying. And he says that actually works with very high level scientists, where you are just saying that the nature of what we study, we need to allow the nature of that which we study to reveal to us the nature of what is there. And therefore, we're not kind of going with a materialist or a positivist view of merely what I can observe, but we're allowing reality to have a voice at some level. And as Torrance is going to say, we become, in a sense, a voice for creation where it can't talk. And therefore, the story of geology and the story of the history of the universe, we can observe and recognize that there's a story there and bring it to voice and recognize what it is that's going on. So that is to say that this book is attempting to set on a platform or at a table a conversation that can have mutually beneficial insight into the discovery of each discipline. And Carrie said, and it's amazing how much disciplines discover from one another in such a way that they see things they would not otherwise have seen. And he gave the example that a lot of the things that were discovered about the movement of planets and all that, the nature of the way that music works, the nature of the interrelationship between the vibrations and all that, there were actually things of what we would call the music of the spheres that by seeing what was happening in the music, they then went and said, I wonder if that works with the movement of planets and other celestial bodies as well. And they did. And so Carrie said in the early phases of the study of the planets and all that, there was quite a relationship between the planets and music, which is quite fascinating. And that is all just to say that, once you're in a mode of exploration, you can start learning from people who don't see things or have things exactly the same as you do, and often they have insights that you say, I wonder if that has something to say to where it is that I look. So I just want to stop and ask, are there any thoughts or questions or comments or clarifications at this point that I can make for anyone with what it is that this book is trying to do and with what the authors are trying to, or the author and editor are trying to do?
Did
Go for it.
Did Carrie mention C.S. Lewis's book, The Discarded Image, in your conversation?
I think he did.
Did
I'm trying to remember what he said. Did he mention something to you?
Well, no, he mentions it on his webpage, Carrie,
Okay.
in the section that you linked us to.
Right.
There's another couple of links there for the PDF presentation,
Yes.
That's excellent. And I remember reading somewhere there, he said that he leaned heavily on C.S. Lewis's discarded image.
Right.
And I have a quote from that book about Copernicus and Galileo when it's appropriate that I like to
Yeah.
send during chat. Short quote.
Right. Well,
So
we will take that. Yeah, the whole thing of the discarded image, I mean, the whole nature of what it means to be human. Carrie and I did talk briefly a little bit about just the question of the science of what we call psychology today versus what I do is more family systems therapy. And the nature of psychology is it looks at the observable human as having thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. They're a physical object, and they are studied as an individual, and particularly with their disorders. So all of the OCD and things like that. So psychology has, in a sense, broken the human apart from the rest. And if we think about the nature of the study of astronomy that's being looked at here as well, the positivist only can see what it is that makes sense to themselves, and that making sense, the sensibility, the common sense kind of thinking, in a sense, that's all the positivist attitude. Whereas to say family systems thinking says, I can see who you are. Tell me about your parents. Tell me about where you grew up. Tell me about your friends. And you begin to understand the nature of the person in the context of the unfolding story of their life. And to say who they are is who they are in relationship. You can see the theological kind of intuition that goes along with that. So the discarded image, when we discard the image of the triune creator, the God revealed in the person of Jesus, exists in relationship, and think of the human discarding the image of God and take on this human individualist kind of image, one could say we're doing bad science and bad theology, right? Because we've broken apart something that needs to be held together to really understand the nature of what is there.
do you remember, this is on a slide, I think, you mentioned OCD.
Yep.
Do you remember a time when they didn't know about OCD or science? Do you remember the time before the book, The Boy That Couldn't Stop Washing? Do you remember that book?
I
That's
don't
the
know if
first.
I remember the time before. I was born in 1958. I don't know what year that book came out.
Oh,
So
well, hey, it came out in about it came out about 30 years later. In
right.
let's see, I was in Cincinnati in 80s. No, yeah, late 80s.
Okay. I just
Yeah,
started reading and family systems thinking all that in the late 80s. So that was when I really became interested in thinking in the ways. And I had enough theological training at that point to recognize that there was something about the nature of what psychology took as its basic manifestations. One, that it looked at problems and defined humans in light of problems instead of who they were in essential related ways of being. Um, and I became skeptical of just looking at those. I think there is a place to recognize obsessive compulsive ways of functioning, but you have to see even those in the context of their relationships. And the
yeah,
study of addictions generally became a bit fascinating to me as a dynamic of our dysfunction in relationships, that addictions are not merely a chemical as we see in drug and alcohol issues,
yeah.
but it's more complex in the way that they're situated within why people even become involved in taking those things to medicate. I mean, the language of medication and what is being covered over, which often has emotional issues in it as well. There are physiological pieces, and so to say a good scientific study of the human needs to look at the whole physiology, history, nature, nurture, and a few other ends probably need to be added on. So Matt, I see your hand up there.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Just well, when you said that about alcoholism, I come out of an alcohol, or about addiction, I come out of an alcohol addiction and my family history. And
Right.
I'm just dealing with a neighbor right now who's dealing with alcoholism, and talking to him yesterday, and he's struggling with it. And he mentioned family relationships and dynamics early on in our conversation. That's very interesting you brought that up. But my initial thing I flashed on was when you were talking about seeing and understanding within the relatedness of things. Is that relate to the Steinke, the Peter Steinke stuff, systems theory, and
Yep.
that whole thing of to be created is to be related? That whole, I think that was really interesting. Is that's connected to what you're discussing
It
here,
is
right?
connected. Yeah. Steinke is one of the authors, along with Richardson and some who've really taken Bowen family systems and applied them to the nature of the church. And so to say, if you think theologically, if God exists in relationship as Father, Son, Spirit, creates the body of Christ with many different gifts and parts who are intended to work together, that to say even the biblical modes of what it means as persons to be functioning together, then the nature of what Bowen discovered in taking schizophrenics and bringing in a family of a schizophrenic and observing them in a hospital for a month, he began to recognize patterns of relationships within them that were causing that phenomena, which we know as schizophrenia, that usually occurred in the third or the fourth generation. And he found the thread that was there was anxiety, that there's something passed on from the grandparent to the parents to, and down, that was evidenced by this breakdown of the personality in the third generation, which anxiety is another word for fear, which is why in my work on addictions, to say the nature of fear, what we have anxiety about is usually going to be a source from which whatever coping mechanism people use, whether it's drug and alcohol, workaholism, exercise, or whatever, that there's something that gets passed down in coping with the anxious place that we find ourselves in our family, which can become work family systems. They cause us then to medicate, to hide, which the word hide there takes us right back to the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve's eyes are opened. And so what do? They've got anxiety, shame, blame, and guilt. And what do? They hide. And so to say the beginning of the addictive process within what we might call sin, now we're looking at the interrelationship of the human in the context of what's intended to be a relationship of openness, honesty, connection, provision by God. Now the human's anxious that God might get them, that there might be punishment. And so the family system is already breaking down right there, because the orderliness, to really tie into this book, the orderliness of God, that there would be a way that God is God and we are humans, gets disrupted in a way that bad science does. And so, the first bad theology, i.e. bad science, was when Adam and Eve are hiding because they misconstrue their understanding of God. So they're already looking at their own condition and, in a sense, making God out to be a problem in the light of that. In a sense, that's the same problem as this book is arguing, that when people look at the stars and all that, and they have to, in a sense, read onto the stars something to make sense of the world, to make sense to themselves, without really understanding God, they're missing the point at some level that is, in a sense, reflective of what's happening for Adam and Eve at the beginning. And so to say, the nature of humanity, the more fearful we become, the more self-protective we become, the more we put up walls and barriers and develop schemes of hiding from others or protecting ourselves from them, whether through words or physical modes of protection. And you might say from that, there's violence everywhere. I mean, that's, Noah and the world of Noah's time. And though the world kind of got Control, Alt, Delete, rebooted then, not everybody knows Control, Alt, Delete anymore. But that's kind of what the flood was. It was a reboot. But to say the nature of humanity, as it has failed to operate within a science of God, that is to work within the orderliness of God as God created the world, the stories that we tell ourselves have led to a disorderliness in the world that is not unlike the reading onto the stars, in a way that in the book, it's a History of Sexual Desire by Stratton, he compares astrology to astronomy, and he says, in astrology, we read onto the stars to find meaning for ourselves from them, same stars as an astronomer would use, or somebody who's going out on a boat across the ocean and needs to guide themselves. It's a different reference to the same set of beings, but to say the modern fascination with controlling our lives has, in a sense, put us into a culture of astrology. We're reading off of the world what will make our life work better without any real reference to the world or other human beings as they exist. And there's all kinds of words we can use for that. The song "Welcome to the Grand Illusion" is, just one of those kind of echoes of the world outside of the wisdom of God that has called us to be with God and with one another in ways where even our sense of self-love is a reflection of the love of God and the love of neighbor. That is an orderly world that is still the hope of the world. And outside of that, the odds of some form of confusion is likely to be there, even though the world thinks that it's a scientific world. Its very science has become blind to the nature of the personal in such a way that it can only see the world and other humans as objects. And so it's limited in its capacity to act appropriately, katafuzen, to the nature of what it means to be persons. There was another hand up there. Somebody else had a hand up, but it's gone now. Who was that?
That was me.
Is that you, Phil? Can you say it in a 7-month-old voice so that it sounds really funny?
I can. I find this all wonderfully fascinating, and I think partly because of the interest in Barth, but also Torrance, and having gotten to know you a little bit, Marty, it's been a pleasure to see someone sort of know both sort of psychology worlds and theology worlds well. I have one question, which is still basically it's bugging me because I'm not sure if it's allowed to be a question, really. I'll try and ask it simply.
Okay.
So psychology in the sort of, if you want, old metaphysical sense, or the way of using the term, is kind of the study of the soul, right? So, Aristotle kind of, will, in his whole metaphysics, it's the form of the matter, which is the soul of the body, that kind of thing, blah, 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 blah. What I love about Torrance Cataphysine principle is that, as you really well described, it's if you want, the object of study basically shapes the method by which study is done. So science is always in a way sort of interrelational, right? So even if that object is non-human, right? So here's the thing. What I'm trying to get my head around, and this comes also as I'm trying to read some figures like Maximus, is whether psychology, as it was talked about in the ancient sense, well, not even just the ancient sense, but psychology is study of the soul, whether this is even really whether this is really possible. Relations can be studied between people, for example. The schools of psychology where you have object relations stuff. Of course, there's the study of biology, physiology, other sciences. And so all of these sort of objects of study are somewhat, for want of a better word, external to the person who's studying them, or can be observed to some extent with some, and of course, when it comes to God, the wonderful, I think, contribution of Barth, is, of course, that God is not merely object, but also subject, and revelation is right the means by which we know Him. So when we turn to the soul, isn't there a problem at which we have to figure maybe that the soul doesn't really have access to itself? That the soul can't really do a kataphysine. There is no sort of kataphysine science of the soul, of the body, sure, because we can observe that and study that. We have physiology, of psychology in the sense in which we observe behavior and relations and meaning, for sure. But there seems to be a kind of circle when we talk about the soul, or am I sort of stumbling over something really obvious? I don't know if you can help me in some way there.
Yes, a simple answer to a complex question. So the question, again, reading from Barth, one could talk about the soul of the body, that is the livingness, which, the Genesis account of the breathing of life into the nephesh that is there, which becomes the psyche in the New Testament sense. You can't have a soul without a body, but you can have the body of the soul, and yet who we are as persons involves both. And so if we're doing kataphusen, I would say, though I don't see Phil, I know that I hear his voice, and that his voice implies to me that there is a speaker where there is a physicality, and the nature of the words that Phil forms means that there is something of intentional being in himself that is his livingness of being, i.e. psyche. There is a third dimension that Barth adds in his discussion in 3.2, and that is the nature of spirit, that the distinction of animals who have both body and soul. Animals are living beings. Dogs are man's best friend, and women's too, some of them. Actually, my wife likes the dog better than I do, probably. So there is a nature of livingness in animals. The spirit of the human that knows and is known by God is a distinguishing feature for Karl Barth. And so to say, does the human know, kataphusen, their own self? Well, one can know that one has a body, because the psyche, the livingness of who we are, senses our body, and it can recognize that there is that aspect of myself that knows my body, which is the livingness of myself, i.e. the psyche. We are, in many cases, blind to the spirit nature of who we are. And so God must reveal to us both who God is, but also it's through God showing us who we are as his beloved that we actually discover the fullness of who we are as spiritual beings, spirit beings, who by the Holy Spirit are brought into the fullness of life that is there. And to use that as a corollary with the stars and everything we're talking about, your body's going to move like the stars will move. And some people will just say, well, I'm just a human. I was made that way without thinking of God. But it's assuming that, and here's where Carrie really separated out secular versus all of the other forms of science, is that from Aristotle on, there is chance and necessity. So if we look at the study of who we are as human beings as merely the necessity of something particularly being and the chances that cause it to come into being, then it becomes, in a sense, just a study of cause and effect, which for many people is what modern science would look like. But to say that we are created by God as those where there's a orderliness that God, who creates us as bodies with souls and created for God, therefore with spirit, that in understanding who God is, we gain insight into understanding the nature of what it means to be beings created by God for God, that the image of God is being restored in us. We gain insight, kataphusen, because we see in Christ that which we are made to be, and we see both where we have gone awry from that, as well as the possibility that comes from it. So the nature of you and I is that we can have a conversation. And so in that conversation, we both discover who the other is, but we also discover something of ourselves as well. So the mutuality of relationship, the Father knows the Son and the Son knows the Father. The Father loves the Son and the Son loves the Father. The Spirit searches and knows the deep things of God. There is an openness within the very being of God that once God reveals it, then our scientific thinking is brought into alignment with the nature of reality. It's more realist than it is if we just think as psychology did, beginning by working with metaphors. The early metaphors for the human were based on machines. So there were those machines that function in a particular way, whether it's a watch or something. I'm trying to remember the name of the early machines that were made in Germany that were kind of human-like. We could say the computer is the modern metaphor that people take, but the early sense of psychology is, how does the machine of the human work? Where is it not working? They moved beyond the machine into the animal. And so the whole nature of behaviorism, the study of the behaviors of animals, it was trying to gain insight into the human through observing the animal. Well, those are all projecting metaphors onto the human that are very much like what this book is seeing, where you are putting causes onto the movement of the stars and the earth that aren't really listening to the nature of what's there, but trying to come up with explanations that tend to be metaphysical in the sense of an abstract thought that's put onto something to try and explain without letting the nature of what is there give its own definition first. So to say the irony of a world that says, oh, Christians, they just have an imaginary friend in God, and they go to church and they just do all these made up things that have been made up in the history of humanity, without being able to see in the mirror that the nature of what the modern human deems as success, that ends up being basically a competition with others, seeking one's own ends. There are patterns in individualism that ultimately become fragmentary, move us away from one another, family relationships break down, loneliness, depression, which are becoming more and more part of the pandemic of the personal in our time, begin to take over. It's a loss of the science of the personal that a proper theological grounding would give us, that aligns us with the nature of what it means to be persons created in the image of God for relationship with God and one another. And that the word health itself, which doesn't maybe get used enough, would be properly informed by understanding who God is, in the same way that in understanding there is a God who is witnessed to in Scripture, who's the creator of the heavens and the earth. It's right up front there in the Bible. And to say, but God creates the heavens and the earth distinct from God. And so it's appropriate for the Greeks and for Copernicus and all of these astronomers to study it, having their own properties within the creativity and the orderliness of God. And so that is Torrance's divine and contingent order applied to the cosmos. And so if we apply that to the human, then we just begin asking about the created nature of God as personal God. How does that inform the nature of who we are as humans created in God's image? How does it inform the nature of the science of our relatedness to one another? And as I said to Carrie Magruder yesterday, if we even just begin on that by recognizing every choice we make is either a choice to accept something and move towards it, including just walking forward, or to resist it, which the biblical term for that is love and fear. Fear is that which causes us to resist something, and love is that way of being that draws us towards something. With humans, it's more overt, but to say, I'm afraid of walking into that wall, I think I'll go through the door, it's really a function of accepting a path that allows me to move forward and not into something that resists me. So in every moment of our life, we are as persons are making these choices, these values that are either drawing us towards or resisting something. And with persons, somebody who appears to us as somebody who loves and accepts us has a transformative way of fulfilling the nature of our being as loving beings. So even just starting with that as a thesis, which is building on the work of John McMurray, would say a psychology, this is a long answer to your question, Phil, sorry if it's too much. That would be a beginning of a theological conversation that's trying to replicate, in a sense, what this book is doing. And that is to say, If we just look at the human with a soul and use our own resources to describe the soul, we're likely to end up with categories that aren't really true to the nature of who we are and our being. If we begin thinking out of the nature of the triune God revealed in the person of Jesus, it actually organizes our thoughts in ways that are true to the nature of what it means to be persons, and it gives us avenues to go forward in the functioning of what it means to be humans in ways that bring the fulfillment God intends for us. Did that help at all?
It certainly has, and I think I feel that my intuition is actually quite similar to yours, particularly regarding terms such as the science of the personal and that kind of thing. I think where I'm still just struggling is the fact that a huge part of the Christian tradition relies on some of this terminology. I mean, in some of the post-Reformation Lutheran discussions, it's a really lively and costly debate whether the soul, so just but how do it's probably not so important. But I think the reason part of it is the reason some of it is such a hot debate, at least in some of the post-Reformation circles, is because they're trying to sort out whether we can really speak about human nature without it having, in some sense, to be already attached to revelation. So Jesus, body and soul, right? And that's Maximus's move, or Leontius of Byzantium as well, where there's just no access to human body and soul unless you're already talking cataphysics, Jesus Christ, right? And then you have the whole and hypostasis and hypostasis thing. And some post-Reformation Lutherans are basically saying, well, it's we have to be able to talk about the soul without revelation in some way, even if it isn't fully informed. Yeah. And I find this just interesting because you have all at once the doctrine of God, the doctrine of incarnation, and a lively debate about natural theology, and whether we have access to any natural knowledge of the human at all. And so I'm just sort of trying to there's a sense in which I feel like it's not an important question if I'm already thinking post-Torrance, which is great. But at the same time, it means that I kind of have to, in some way, sidestep some of the really formative debates within the Christian tradition who have used these terms in order to, and I think this, to be honest, this is a struggle for my thinking anyway. The fact that we have had to adopt a lot of even Greek terminology in order to discuss what we mean when we talk about the human for most of the Christian tradition, and how to square that with, even a more Old Testament picture where you don't get to do much, if any, metaphysics of the human, and you're already talking about relations, right? So the Hebrew way of talking about the human, even when it's talking physiologically, it's related to the social instantly. There's just no way of conceiving with the human without the social. And so, it's a tough one because I want to think within the Christian tradition, but somewhat without its terms.
I think that, the nature of this book invites us, as Carrie Magruder says, to recognize there is a value in cross-disciplinary discussions. He says one of the things that this book has as a problematic perspective is that it missed the value of Islamic arithmetic and studies. The person who Nebelsick actually quotes on that was actually a Christian who is trying to dismiss the influence of Islamic thought in the history of science. But Carrie says that is a tragic mispoint, and the fact that it was done intentionally is to miss a huge part of the story of how we ended up with the insights that we did. And there was certainly a huge awareness for people like Copernicus of these Islamic thinkers who had moved centuries before into things that he was able to put together and bring into Western thought, basically. So to say, when we talk about Greek thought, the parallel to what we're dealing with here would be Greek mythology. Does Greek mythology give us insight into the nature of the human soul? Well, if we talk about narcissism today, we're looking at a Greek story of Narcissus. If we talk about the Oedipus complex, we're looking at parent-family relationship breakdowns. To say that there was something in the observation of the human in their related ways of being in the world that were played out in mythology, that you don't want to just throw them out and say, oh, they were just projecting onto the God things, but you want to say they recognize dysfunction really early on in Greek mythology, and it's really parallel to what it is that they were doing with the circles of the stars. And so we don't want to just throw out what they said. We want to say they didn't understand necessarily why the stars were functioning in the way they did, the modifications that actually made them not as perfect as one thought. But that in Greek mythology too, they did see things that were actually worth taking note of. They gave them names that we're still using. And so if we want to understand some of the phenomenology of the breakdown of human relationships, the Greeks gave us in many ways language and stories that help us to understand the nature of some of those breakdowns, and particularly the breakdowns. They don't give us what the gospel gives us, and that is the intention of what it looks like to live within the fulfilling, loving relationships for which we were made. The Greek gods tended to play out what one might call the brokenness of humanity, seeking its own ends. So that's a language that's part of what we need. And to say, is that a description of the nature of the soul? Well, yes, it is in its dysfunctional elements. So we can't throw those observations out and say they're meaningless, but rather that the nature of what it is that observation gives us is data to keep building on and to keep searching katafusen for each thing on its own terms, to be seen for what it is. And to say Einstein, just within the last century, looking at the nature of light and the nature of gravity, when he stopped going with older renditions of what might be happening, he was able to look anew at the katafusen, the nature of the thing itself, and to just ask better questions that let reality be revealed. And so we could say there are things there in the ancient Greek stories that they're a beginning point. They give us a beginning language of talking about the soul. They don't give us what we need for the healing of the soul, but now we know who is the healer of the soul. And so we can say, oh, they showed us the problems. The nature of the God revealed in Jesus showed us the healing of that, the nature of reconciliation, redemption, the acknowledgement of fear and the way it traumatizes, but that what perfect love does is it casts out that fear and allows for the soulishness and the spiritual being to be restored in the relationships for which it was intended. So there's a huge parallel to what's happening in all of these, to say they had actually amazing wisdom. They just were missing the key pieces of katafusen, reality, once seen as the creative work of God and the orderliness that God intends, and what it looks like to operate according to that. And so that is still the hope of the gospel. And every day I watch the news, I just go, if only the church could learn to communicate the gospel to this culture, which is so divided and self-protective. The answers are all there, and not in a trite way, but in a complex way, to say we need to rearrange our thinking so that it isn't driven by the fear of if I lose control, all of these ways that the human becomes curved in on ourselves in our self-protection and self-interest, which the Greeks saw millennia ago. But to learn the way of self-sacrifice and seeing the neighbor and building up the neighbor, and what it means to create communities of care from cradle to the grave, and what it looks like to live that, and to see beyond the grave the hope of what it is that the gospel promises, that there's something there that transforms even how we live this life, that is not filled with fear. So we are well served to learn the language of the soul in the ancient Greek forms of it, but not to collapse into it as truth-telling in its entirety, but to begin to be attentive to what it what it was that was going on. Carrie said last night that in much of the history of the relationship between mathematics and physics, which again, when you started measuring the stars and all that, you had to start putting numbers and measuring things to get the movement that was there. He said what were called the mathematicians were those who really paid attention to detail, and those who were in physics were what we would in many ways call metaphysical. So the spheres have to be perfect. And the day that began to fall apart is when they believed that all spheres had to have perfect spherical. They had to be smooth and perfect. And the day they were able to get a binoculars, telescope, and look at the moon and say, look, guys, this moon is not perfect on the outside. The school of physics, in a sense, fell apart in terms of its metaphysical belief that we have to go with this idea of perfect smoothness is what a sphere looks like, and say, oh, reality has to shape it, not merely our ideals of smoothness and perfection and harmony. So the nature then of the study of the physical world, we are so far behind in the realm of the personal. People are so uncomfortable with the emotions that we have not entered into a real study of the nature of the emotional dimension of who we are as human beings. And the church, at some level, don't let your emotions take you away. Well, the problem with that is emotions are our relationship. If you don't have a relationship, if you don't have emotions, there is no relationship. And to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength is a emotion-filled way of being with another. So because the church hasn't paid attention to understanding true emotions based on the reality that's there, they've just thrown out all emotions at some level for a rational faith. We haven't learned the discernment of when it's good to be afraid of something or to pursue something and when not. So the emotion of is it gonna fulfill me becomes the dominant emotional thing. And so what do people do? They become consumers, materialists, and their emotions are still full force, but it's just going for everything that we haven't learned the emotion that comes from wisdom in our choices. So the church needs to learn to become the best at articulating, what are emotions, what are true emotions, how do we nurture the emotions of love in the way that they work out in the actions of our lives with people who are dear to us. To again use family systems thinking to say, if anxiety is the glue that holds most families together, that might be a problem. What would it look like for families to really be held together in love? What would it look like for parents to actually understand how to lovingly, and that doesn't mean you don't have discipline, but often I say to parents, does your child know that you love them? And they say, of course they do. We tell them all the time. And then I get that child in another room and say, so do you feel like your parents love me? And unfortunately, quite often they say no, and they'll list all the things they do to control, manage, punish, and they don't feel known. So we have parents who haven't learned the basic emotion of what does it look like to communicate love in such a way that the child actually feels that and can confirm it. Right, so that's katafusen now. Now we're not just I'm in my mind it must be working, but we're actually training what it means to live the life of love with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, all in congruence with one another. And so to say that's part of the science of the personal that good theology would lead us to explore and develop. And I think Linda's book actually on hospitality is an attempt to engage in that kind of thinking. I mean, as I read, I think that there's something that you're trying to bring the theology of the hospitality of one person to another into a practical way of being that I would say that is an outworking of the science of the personal from a theological point of view. So I don't know if any of that helped, Phil.
I appreciate what you're saying about the family systems and anxiety, because I speak from a family system where my brother is schizophrenic and my nephew is developing those symptoms. He's high functioning Asperger. And in our family system, my immediate family, anxiety, sensitivity, nervousness, a lot of those things were a part of our family system. We spent a lot of time hiding, so to the place I am right now in my life, the Lord's been talking to me a lot about hiding because my personality tends to be lean that direction. And the reality that being a person involves indwelling one another, and this happens to be a part of my GCI studies at the GCS studies at the moment, but indwelling one another is a part of being a person. Whereas so much of my life, I was raised as an individual, and yet in that same breath, differentiating was not allowed. And so it's kind of, you're processing all this junk. It's amazing. But anyway, I just wanted to say, I appreciated your remarks about that, because it really speaks to that whole thing about who we are as persons. And the making room thing, I think that's where God was leading in that whole thing, is if the Trinity lives in this way, where each is unique, yet equal, yet one, and we're created to manifest that, reflect that in our own, being as humans, it should affect the way we relate to one another. I mean, that should be, that's how God wants that's what he wants for us, because that's who we are. So, and I mean, so.
Absolutely. And the word differentiation, that is the term for a healthy person in a family system. A differentiated person is, I'm connected to you, I'm with you, but I'm not collapsed into you. I can be myself, and I can allow you to be yourself. And I mean, that's what a loving, accepting relationship looks like. So, and just in terms of today's study, I mean, to say science and theology have to be differentiated. The world is not God, but God is the one that creates the world, sustains the world. God is not the world, pantheism, and yet God is present to and cares for the world that he created, sustains, and accompanies. So that's a differentiation kind of understanding too. And to say that is what Torrance and Bart, that's ultimately what they're trying to get to, is where we're not collapsing one into the other. But it comes down to, as you say, the very practice of a family. If you can't be yourself in a family, I mean, if you just think about what that says, you can't be yourself for the fear of what's going to happen. That means you're becoming a not self, a non-self. Something is being lost there. And often the parent will think, oh, my child is such a good child. They're obedient, they obey, and all they're doing is hiding all the time.
Exactly.
And so the problem of the not katafuzen in that, not aware of the other, not knowing them, not having love be the very nature of the connection, all of that just says we have not learned katafuzen well, and that is profoundly problematic. Thanks, Linda.
Yeah.
Matt, you've got some comments up there about Descartes and the nature of Descartes. That move was a fracturing move on the nature of what it means to be human, and for human knowledge to be, I think, therefore I am. At some level, that is a separation from the world that individualizes in a way that's not helpful. I think there is a sense in paying attention to the fact that we do have separate bodies and we look at each other. There is a distinctness of ourselves. But if that ever overcomes or denies the fact that we're connected also, then it's profoundly problematic. And so, so the gospel calls us to see one another and to listen to one another and to say we belong together. We are brother and sister, and we will listen well. We won't become codependent, which I call codependence is living inside someone else's lie. Somebody says, I need this, I need you to be this. And it's like, okay, well, I guess I'll have to give up what I want. Well, you've just bought a lie and giving yourself up. So the nature of Descartes, he led us in out of reality into a knowledge of the self that lost the sense of our connectedness with the world. On the question of what I said, the nature of the person is similar to the nature of the Trinity, I would turn that around to say the nature of the triune God is personal and defines what person means. We are created in God's image, therefore we are created as persons to have a personal relationship with that God, and to say that the nature of the person there is that God is intentional and acts in a way that's consistent with that intention and addresses us as persons intended for response. That the full dynamic of personal showing up, acting and speaking in a way that's consistent, and the invitation of the other into that is all part of what we're talking about there, which my TED talk on deep personal relationships basically builds on that. And within that, I actually build the structure of personal relationships out of Karl Barth's definition of interpersonal action in 3.2. I don't name it all with exactly Barth language, but that's what it's building on. So persons in communion, that is the Trinity, essentially, Father, Son, Spirit. Our definition, I mean, the whole nature of what we mean by person, that has been a long history, and people like John Zazoulis and others have been, trying to battle that question out. That was the very nature of what my doctoral work is on, a comparative assessment of the concept of freedom in the anthropologies, persons, of John McMurray, John Zazoulis, and Karl Barth. So to identify what do we mean by persons specifically from God, and then what is the fulfillment of what it means to be persons. That has been my driving question my whole life. So we could go into a lot about even those three, but beyond that, to say the church in the West still does not understand the word personal well. So people do their personal devotions, which means by myself. And I am the one who's driving it. And a few other things that are problematic in that I made a personal decision for Christ. Who's that about? Me, my decision, what I did for Jesus. It's like, yeah, we're missing something here. Right? The book that Mike Hobbits has coming out, I have an article in there on Barth, Torrance, and evangelical thought on the nature of a personal relationship with Jesus. And the problem of Descartes, that we've made it about us and not about the nature of the interdynamic of who the triune God is, who invites us into that knowing and being known. And so, yeah, we are similar. The language of likeness, image and likeness out of Genesis 1:27 is that to say, yes, we are like them because we have been made for correspondence, to live in Christ with them by the work of the Spirit. We haven't done a lot of the outline so far, but we're getting a lot of extra stuff here, aren't we, Bill? The real reason why Copernicus raised no ripple and Galileo raised the storm may well be that whereas the one offered a new supposal about celestial motions, the other insisted on treating this supposal as a fact. If so, the real revolution consists not in a new theory of the heavens, but a new theory of the nature of theory.
That's from Discarded Image.
Right.
That's Lewis, and he quotes a man by the name of A.O. Barfield, Saving the Appearances.
Owen Barfield, yeah.
Barfield? Really?
Owen Barfield. He was a major influence for Tolkien and Lewis. He was one of their favorite people. I mean, yeah.
So
On is a book.
Can you speak to that?
I can't well enough.
Not in the new theory of the heavens, but a new theory of the nature of theory.
The nature of theory. So, I mean, if the word theory comes from the same root as what we call the theater. It's the human as observer separated from. So if theories are things that we do by looking at the stars and thinking there must be gods or divine forces moving around, then our theory is from our theater seats, observing and calculating. But if our theory takes on a Einsteinian, Polanyian indwelling, and we begin to live within what's going on, our theory is now one that has to comply, katafusen, with the nature of what's there. And so theory itself is now taking on a reflection that is being filled out by the nature of that which is known. So if I have a theory about you, Bill, I could come up with a theory in my armchair, observe, all kinds of things about you, and that would be a theory by observation. If I say, I want to know you, Bill, tell me the story of your life, and I take notes on it, and then I read it back and say, does this reflect who you are? Well, the nature of my theory in methodology was I need to hear from you to fill out the thoughts, the reflections, those things that would be words that would be true to you, because I have allowed you to fill that out. So the nature of theory has been transformed in that process.
Well, so the title of the book, which Kerry Magruder relies upon to put together his presentation that you sent
Yes.
to us, he uses, as I mentioned, C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image, and the discarded image seems to be that whole Middle Ages approach to the world, to the cosmos. Matter of fact, on the back cover, there is a quote that goes, "The discarded image by Lewis portrays the medieval conception of a model of the world, which Lewis described as the medieval synthesis itself, the whole organization of their theology, science, history into a single, complex, harmonious mental model of the universe." And that's the discarded image.
Yeah, the mental model. This book deals with all those things, the necessity of harmony, unity, and all those things, but it creates a mythological God and a mythological world that's not there. So it loses the realist engagement with the nature of the God who creates the world with all of its distinctives and interacting parts that are part of God's creation. So the nature of the medieval synthesis, that's Thomas largely. So Thomas Aquinas largely built on Aristotelian thinking, and Aristotle, and it was only in reading this book that I kind of saw this. I always kind of thought in the dualism that Torrance talks about, Plato with the world of forms was kind of the mental side, and that Aristotle really paid attention to the physical world and laid a foundation in that identifying of all the parts with what we would call today the physical world or modern science. But he identifies in this book that Aristotle had everything built out of the unmoved mover and ultimate causes. And so at some level, there is also an idealizing overarching picture that these forces, divine forces, are again noticing the world that's there, but it's interpreting it all through a mythological lens. So the medieval synthesis takes the logic of the pieces, all that, and tries to read the Christian gospel in it, but it removes the personal God who comes in Jesus and replaces it with the principles of a system that is a philosophy based on Aristotle that doesn't have the revelation of God in the person of Jesus as its logic to it. Its logic arises really from a human logic based on Aristotle with a layer of the metaphysical, the divine, that kind of gets replaced with Christian, but it hasn't dealt with the basic thing of where is the God, where are we really gaining access to this God, to know this God and understand everything in light of that God. So the nature of the Jesuits, Kerry Magruder said, the Jesuits were actually better at not going with Aristotle in that way. And so they ended up being able to stand against some of the impulses of what were part of the medieval synthesis and became more the scholars that paid attention to the world in more of a Katafusan kind of a way.
Thank you.
So, and the other thing I have to say that well, not just Kerry, I have 2 book reviews. And this, the guy who wrote these book reviews is in that video. Gingrich is his name. He wrote 2 book reviews on the Circles of God. And in both of them, he said, it was a nice try and I was looking forward to it, but he missed a critical point. And Carey says he missed the point because Nebelsick wrote before this Copernican revolution came in place, and Gingrich, who wrote these articles, spoke for Carey on Copernicus at University of Oklahoma. And he said he had just developed so much of the thoughts beyond it that the ways that Nebelsick thought about Copernicus had Copernicus basically succumbing to the Greek circles kind of thesis and had a theology that was based on that. And what Gingrich had found out since then, and Carey said, actually, there were people who were saying this even in Nebelsick's time. If he had done his research properly, there were actually voices that were coming out and giving what has become now the dominant thesis, that Copernicus was known as having it right, not collapsing to those, and that people were studying it. There wasn't a lot of pushback. And so the logic that was being used as to why Copernicus was quote unquote resistant all that, none of it actually has held up with the flowering of Copernican studies. And so Gingrich is a Christian who's saying, you were right in some of the beginning parts, but you misread Copernicus and what he did in the proper relation of having a God who does create and seeing the world for what it is, katafusen, and allowing those things to allow a prominent Christian astronomer to have their voice and to see the contribution they make in what theology should do. Good theology, good science of the world, each treated katafusen without confusing the one with the other. So, I mean, when I write the article, ultimately in these 12 books, that's one of the things I'll have to bring in, is that there's a contribution that is here in recognizing the history of science and the clarification of where it goes wrong and the need to move beyond it. But that even within this series, the very problems can arise that you haven't seen as much as what continuing good science will do to reveal the need to keep clarifying, what are we talking about? What are the assumptions that we're reading into it that don't need to be there, that allow for a more satisfying outcome? So anyway, I've written the references for, there are actually 3 book reviews that I put on the next to the last and the last page, reviews at the bottom. So Circles of God by Owen Gingrich. And then there's another one at the top of the last page. And then there's an article that's available online that's in Tradition and Discovery by David Bagchi. He didn't have the same concerns as Gingrich did, but it's a nice short little review, which Carey really liked the last paragraph of this this review from the Polanyi review, which says the central thesis of the book is the principle pioneered by Torrance that nature has its own rationality imparted by God on whom it is contingent. Alien perceived patterns need not and should not be imposed upon it. The difficulty this thesis encounters is that nature's quote unquote divine rationality may be no more than a human preconception. It may be that the beauty, symmetry, and rightness, those are the words you just used there, of the new physics are the modern transitory equivalent of celestial circularity. In other words, we're still reading things in just like they did in the ancient world, and we need to be attuned to that. And Torrance's agenda, as well as Nebelsick's, to point in that way. Perhaps there is no final solution to this problem. Nebelsick himself rejects the opinion of Osiander, the Lutheran scholar, which Carey says he's actually wrong too. And he talks about this in the what he has posted there at his site, who believed in the value of hypothesis which accounted for the evidence, even if they eventually turned out to be untrue. A continual process of self and mutual correction. This is the church being the church and doing good science, right? A continual process of self and mutual correction may well prevent us from looking fools to later generations and lead us near the truth where all disciplines meet. And Carey just said, there's the attitude. We need to bring these things out, have the conversations, allow for the corrections, even this book to say it puts out an important proposal, it misses some points, let's correct and keep moving forward. So, I mean, there's an attitude as much as anything, I think, that's really, it's helpful to pick up out of what it is that this book offers us here. And Phil says he was one of those obedient hiders. He was first of all a hister, but then he got a spell checker and became a hider. So that's good. And yes, you'll have to watch that, Matt, that video. Oops, you must go. You are gone. So I want to look at, there's just one paragraph in the foreword by Torrance to this book, and I just want to briefly look at that. Just to understand, I mean, one of the questions that I asked with Carrie is, why did Torrance gather these authors together? What did he hope for them to bring? And how does he express that for us to see why these books are important for Torrance studies? So at the bottom of Roman numeral X in the beginning, in an earlier work, Theology and Science, everything up to that point is in every volume of the 12 has the first part, and then he adds a paragraph or two to explain this particular volume. So in an earlier work, Theology and Science and Mutual Modification in 1981, Professor Harold P. Nebelsick set out to clarify the tangled connections between theology and natural science that have characterized Western thought since Isaac Newton. And Carrie said, there's always going to be tangled connections. And so if we think we're going to untangle connections, then we're going in the wrong direction. He said, we always need to come as those who are committed to Trinitarian incarnational theology, but to sit with people who are Copernicus scholars and others and just say, we all come, let's listen to each other and learn, instead of saying, you have to see it my way. We just need to show up authentically as who we are. So he likes that word, tangled connections, and that we need to sustain that. Here, however, he offered the results of a further probing into those interconnections by tracing them from the very rise of science in ancient times to the Copernican revolution of the 16th century. And part of that is to say, we've done a really poor job of doing history in the church. And so we need to understand the history and where things got off, or we're bound to repeat history. Right? And he mentioned the Islamic mathematics and just the importance of that. He said, at this point in the United States, the number of professors who know about the profound influence of Arabic math and astronomy in the United States is at this point 0. He said we had one, he was stolen by McGill University in Canada. So on the North American continent, there's one person who's aware of, this huge contribution. And it just says that, we're losing and blind to a part of the history of humanity and its understanding of the natural world. And we end up in our not recognizing the value of people maintaining and understanding those things. We just become more and more blind.
Well, Terry, in his presentation, noted cross-cultural
the value
effect.
of that, yes.
Yes. Well, why
and that's to say, the United States has not been good at sustaining that. They have not gained or acknowledged the value, even to find a history of science program. I mean, the University of Oklahoma is a bit of a unique program. Not every school has that. He says it's really not a hugely valued discipline, but it should be. And to say to do Torrance studies is to begin to get an education in the history of human thought, theological thought, and as well as the sciences, in a way that not everyone gets, and most people don't get.
And the prejudice against the Arab mathematicians is due to religious reasons?
In the case in this book, he said the person who was being quoted on those, it was because of religious reasons that he was being that. He mentioned the story of that professor and the one who wrote these reviews getting into a cab once at a astronomy conference and just yelling at each other because they so vehemently disagreed. And this other person just had an agenda, And the person who's become, the great Copernicus scholar, just, couldn't put up with it. And so to say, these battles are being fought out by individuals who are, in a sense, fighting for a whole picture of the future and to sustain huge traditions of human history and the contribution they made. And I don't even know what all we haven't seen yet of the contribution they made. Right? I mean, we don't necessarily have all of what they made. We are just becoming more aware that contributions were made. And some things that we think are quite new may have been around for a millennium or more before that. And there may be things they knew then that we haven't rediscovered yet. And what is called the Renaissance was that the church had in many ways destroyed a lot of the works of ancient writers that they thought contended with Christian doctrine. And the Renaissance was in many ways, we went and raided the libraries of the Islamic world and gave rebirth to what is called classical knowledge, Aristotle, Plato, and all these others, which reinfused the age of humanism, right? For better or for worse. And there was a lot of good that came from that as well as a lot that didn't. But the whole thing of just saying, when you bury the past, you have no idea how much livingness you are burying in that. And part of the nature of the revitalization of Trinitarian theology is to acknowledge that there are profound things that we have lost in the basics of what the gospel is, who the God is that's revealed there. And so we replace it with new forms of idols and success and things that is replacing God. And it's the same kind of blindness as we find in all of these other disciplines. And it can happen, it can go on for millennia. And generally being blind isn't good. So, I mean, all that to say, the fact that Torrance has helped us to look back at history and to recognize that we need to have conversations and to understand even those who may not share our theological perspective, there may be a ton to be learned. And so we need to be more confident in who we are and more open to listening. And he actually said, basically based on this little introduction here, Torrance invited people who he may not have agreed with everything to say what they had to say for the sake of the conversation. That people often think that Torrance is merely contentious and has his, my way or the highway. But he says, no, these books show that he was really very open to inviting people into a conversation to further the study of all of the sciences and what it looks like to work together in a deeper and richer understanding that happens when we sit at the table and have the conversation, which I thought is a wonderful understanding of who Torrance is and what he invites these writers as well as us into.
In your outline, Carrie Magruder questions in response to reviews below.
Yes.
About Gingrich raises a number of very interesting questions.
Yes.
Two of which, to what extent was TFT's thinking subject to similar critique? And B, did TFT eschew creating a school of Torranceans?
Yeah, so what do you think about that?
Well, I don't know that he would go along with that so much.
No.
Yeah, what
right.
do you think?
No, Bart was very much against that. And I would say Torrance didn't want Torranceans either. When you put a name like that, you begin limiting people, right? And, if people say, well, you're a good preacher, but you're not as good as Eugene Peterson or, whoever all you've done is limit that person instead of saying, Eugene Peterson's good. And whoever your favorite preacher is.
Well,
And
Paul's good. Apollo is good.
Paul's good. Yeah, exactly. There is a limitation that we put on one another when we hold up an ideal, even of ourselves, that we need to be this thing instead of recognizing that by grace we are all called to be who we are, and to allow that grace to do a work in us that in the end people give glory to God because of what it is that we bring to the world by virtue of the God who gives that grace to us and allows us to serve and to be present in the ways that we are.
I agree. Yeah,
So I think Torrance would have had that sense as well. And my hope is that in really putting T.F. Torrance forward, he gives us tools to see things we wouldn't in our own world, which again, the nature of what I do with the nature of personal relationships and therapy and all that. There are a few who kind of do a little bit of that, Ray Anderson being one who did some.
mhm.
But he again, he's been gone long enough now. There have just come into being things that he wouldn't have been able to see then. And there are many who've never read Trinitarian theology and thought of putting theology and therapy together in the way that T.F. Torrance has allowed me to do it. And there's a lot of books on the integration of theology and therapy, but they generally try and sustain kind of the axioms of each of them, i.e., psychology, there is an individual. Therapy then has to collapse into something that deals with the individual. And so Jesus comes in helping the individual, and I go, well, you gave away the farm. Right? And I've not seen many constructive therapeutic systems. I mean, even those family systems people, Ron Richardson, Stanky, and all that, have not built on a Trinitarian theology in doing their family systems work. I think they have the right outcome of it, but they haven't got the missing piece that really builds on the Trinity. I have one chapter in my third volume of Face to Face that is the Trinity and family systems that's attempting to fill in a little bit of that place. What's his name who wrote Connections? He's one of the great Christian therapists. He's not coming to mind right now, but he wrote the book Connections, and he talks about Christians and relationality and all that. He has one page where he uses the word Trinity, but he does nothing that takes the Trinity to explain anything to figure out his system of what connections in the church might look like.
Well, I'll look at that. I have that volume of yours. So
right.
I have it's in the stack, on the stack.
You have a stack of books?
Well, metaphorically speaking, it's a Kindle book. So
yep. Yeah, chapter 9, puzzle pieces, Trinitarian theology and family systems therapy. Okay. So that is an attempt to work some of that out. There's other sections that deal with it as well, but that certainly is a bit of it there.
Tell us again when you're due to publish in the journal this article.
The one on personal relations, that one is coming out in Mike Howitt's book, which is published by Lexham Press, and it's up for pre-publication now. The next article in Participatio that's coming out is on Tom Smale and Tom Torrance and the Holy Spirit. You're referring to the one on this? I think that the essay that will be in the science edition, I think that is a year or two at least away.
Oh, okay.
I have also discovered that there's another series of 5 books that T.F. Torrance was editor for before this series, which I'll go through those books in 2024. Basically there's 12 that I'll do this year. I'll do the 12 in this series, one a month. And then 2024, I'll do the 5 books from that other series, which I have 2 of that series so far. I've got the T.F. Torrance one and one other, the Ian Paul one in that series. But they're also theology and science. So it's just, Kerry Magruder is, he's obviously quite interested in that. And so he's doing a Participatio article, or two issues of Participatio on that. So he's inviting people who have interest in those particular things to fill in on that piece.
Good.
I'm just going to read a little bit more from this introduction by T.F. Well, the ancients held that the way to think about nature bears on what we think about God. It has become clear that the way we think about God profoundly affects the way we think about nature. So that's the reversal that Torrance is aiming for, that this book, in a sense, is going to play out. The specific theme of this book, pursued with detective-like persistence, though I said to Kerry there, except in those things where he's wrong, relates to the way in which a wrong conception of circularity linked with divine rationality helped and hindered the progress of science. How did it help? It gave us a divinely ordered world. People started asking questions about the nature of the orderliness. They just misplaced who God was, and they ended up with humanly projected images and idols of God that missed God. That is the problem that came from that. It was only with a deep change in the understanding of God at work in European culture that science was enabled to shake off harmful Greek theological and scientific ideas and develop an autonomous field of knowledge on its own. So that's the influence of Christian thought, Reformation, and after that changes the nature of all that's going on. And Carrie will talk about the Lutheran universities that were part of the context of the early works in astronomy that are part of this. And so Christians looking at the nature of the world through the eyes of God as creator were able to see and understand differently and allow science to have its own proper domain and method, as well as to understand God in a more helpful kind of way. Yet that is not the whole story, as Dr. Nebelsick shows, for there remains an inevitable, if subtle, kind of symbiosis at work in which scientific and theological inquiry in autonomy and openness to one another gives rise to an underlying harmony which may be fruitful to both inquiries. And so Carrie loved that last little bit, just that there is intended to be an open and understanding harmony that we have as scientists and theologians that allows both of us to learn from each other, to acknowledge a realist epistemology in a way that says, God has come, walked this earth, spoken, lives, and his words still speak and live with us here today. That is a realist theology, and the world that God creates, what it looks like to attend to the world, to care for the world, to care for one another. We have tons still to discover. Only our wisdom makes us fools, because our wisdom tends to be so self-focused and self-centered that it keeps us from living in light of the reality of the God who would align our science to better be the stewards and caretakers that are appropriate to the God who creates and accompanies us in this world. You've got a thought there, Bill.
Lewis has a quote somewhere in there that I came across this morning that said something like, back during those ages, those times, people who were ignorant were much more aware of their ignorance than we are today.
That's good.
I thought that was classical Lewis there.
Yes. Lewis has a wonderful turns of thought. Yeah, there's no one so blind as he who will not see, is another way of saying that. So the invitation of Torrance and of this book is to say these subjects could be seen as just the history of a bunch of discoveries, but they really are about the discovery of discovery, or the theory of theory, or what does it mean to live in the world in ways that are appropriate to God and the world. And to say that really is the invitation in it all. And again, the 5 chapters, on Greek theology and science, it's a review of those ways of thinking that ultimately begin to see that the world was there, but read in all kinds of mythological, metaphysical things that were not helpful. The 2nd chapter, measuring the universe, they got better at figuring out how to measure and how to note and take data on all the things that were there, which improved science. Getting the data was an improvement, but they still maintained a lot of ordering of the universe that was based on things that were metaphysical and mythological. Chapter 3, Science Encounters the Christian Faith. There was John Philoponus, who Torrance will note, but he wasn't really taken seriously, so he had to get rediscovered literally centuries later. The rest still built a lot on Greek philosophical ways of thinking, and so even early Christian science still had issues to deal with. Chapter 4, the late medieval cosmology. Again, Thomistic thought was largely built on Aristotle and trying to bring that philosophy and Christianity together. Dante, as a poet, maintained again visions that in many ways downloaded a God who was not the God revealed in the person of Jesus. So even the poets have a role to play in scientific thought, in the vision that we have of the world. And then the Islamic infusions that came in allowed for insights that were based on actual readings of the world that actually did help some, though have not been discovered with all that could be there. And so the final chapter, chapter 5, the Copernican cosmology, again, Nebelsick argues that Copernicus stayed indebted to the circles, and Gingrich and Carey Magruder said, no, he did not. The story has changed. He needs to be recognized and given honor for all that that is there. Phil, great to have you with us. It is unfortunate you have to dash, but we're about done too. So blessings on you and thanks for being here. So that final section then, the last little bits on theory and reality and discovering truth. To say the nature of this book at some level is an exercise in asking how do we recognize the value of theory appropriately discerned from the nature of reality and not in all the ways that we project onto it. And to recognize, that's fake news is another way of saying that. Theology and the sciences are very susceptible to fake news throughout history. And this book has, in a sense,
alternative truth.
Alternative truths, alternative realities. And so the ultimate goal of discovering truth for the church to say, we are going to be a scientific community who continue to, in humility, to listen, to respond, to test, and to recognize that, the nature of starting with the reality of the God revealed in Jesus gives us the best science possible. And it calls us to call out when it is fake news. And it calls us to be those who propose ways to live in light of the reality of who God is, what it means to be communities of knowing and being known in a world that is contingent upon God's presence and care for us. And that when we live in the light of that, it makes a difference on the nature of what it means to live appropriately in the light of that. And so to say science is that activity of human beings as communities who explore and understand the world, personal and impersonal, so that we might live better in the light of it, recognizing that God is the source, sustainer, and holds the end of it all in his hands. That is a view of science that holds it all together with all of its diversity and particularity.
Amen.
Yeah. Anything else from you, Matt? Adonis? I'm not sure if I'm saying your name right, Adonis. Is there anything else that you want to bring up or questions? We have in a sense covered everything. I think we've gotten the main points of this book. Anything else there? Apparently not.
I do
Next-
like the way he said Kepler was it who smashed circles into ellipses or squashed something
Yeah.
like that.
Which is a move towards reality. I mean, that's, yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's good. Good. Well, our book next month, we do these once a month, will be Ian Paul, Science and Theology in Einstein's Perspective. So we're going to move into an Einsteinian reading of the universe. And
There
he
is
wrote,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
that's okay. Go ahead.
I was just about to say there's a NPR or PBS video called The Young Einstein.
Okay.
It's not bad. It's
Right.
more of a something.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
worth a look.
I will look for Carey to suggest. He always has great, fun suggestions, and he may have something too. I'm not sure what he has on Einstein, but I think by the time we're through all 12 of these books, our thinking will be expanded in all kinds of ways that we didn't even know what was missing. So that would be a good thing. So anyway, next week I'm going to be doing a office hours. We
Okay.
haven't done one for a while, and I've got enough catching up on things to do that it'll allow me to not have all my time tied for this. This was a lot of reading to get ready for this one. I read the whole book and all
I
that.
didn't
So
read
anyway,
the whole book.
I read it in about over the course of the month, and as well as doing my writing on Karl Barth and all that, I've been reading this book as well. So
Well,
and book reviews and other things. So.
I checked it out of the library. It came in from a seminary someplace, a couple of days. So
Good
great.
job.
Yeah.
Good. But now you have to turn it back in.
Yeah. That's the thing.
Okay. Good. Well, blessings on you all, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you so much.
You bet.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.